we're going to go ahead and get started, even though I know people are still trying to sign in and get snacks and whatnot. I am Professor Andrea Vieux. I teach political science here. Thank you for everybody for coming. I'm joined here by Senator Dinah Sykes, who is the minority leader of the Kansas Senate currently, and also Tim Owens, who is a former Kansas Senator. And I should say Tim also used to teach political science here, and he has also participated in our Veterans Oral History Project. That's one of our professors of history is doing along with the Veterans Office. So thank you for that as well. So if you're interested in the Veterans Oral History Project, a lot of those interviews are up on the JCCC YouTube. So I would just kind of direct you to that if you were wanting to find out more about that. So today we're going to talk about what the Kansas Legislature does and then how it impacts our lives. So I'll start with the first question for Senator Owens. The Kansas Legislature is only in session during the spring semester, whereas other states, about 10 other states, stay in session the entire year long. How does the session length impact the work that the Kansas Legislature does?
Well, that's an interesting question, because when you only have a short period of time during the year to actually accomplish your goal of passing as many bills as you can or you want to get passed, if you have that short a time, you're limited on what you might be able to get done. The states that are there all year long, obviously, that's a different thing, but in Kansas, sometimes you are limited on how many bills you can actually get through, because they get a lot of bills and a lot of different committees. So you can be very limited on how many you can actually pass. And some people get really disappointed that their bill may not get passed simply because the limitation in time that we have. So I don't know whether that's the kind of response.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, and so with a shorter legislative session, it basically means you have to limit the amount of bills that you're looking at, and that means you just can't address all the problems. Is that what I'm hearing here? Right, great. So relatedly, with such a short period of time to conduct legislative business, how does the legislature determine which policies and bills it's going to discuss, and then what challenges are faced with that process?
So that is really up to the majority party, because the majority party, so you're a Senate president on the Senate side and the Speaker of the House. On the House side, they determine where the bills go. They decide who is the chair of each committee, and then that chair has a lot of authority on which bills that they want to see. So being in the minority party, you have to be very creative, and you try to get your bills heard. And I meet with the president once a week and trying to say, you know, can I get this hearing, working with chairmen of committees to try to get hearings for the bills that I care about. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't, then you're looking at how can I amend my bills into bills that I see are moving. And you have this thing in the legislature called germane, which it has to have 3 points of contact to be germane to amend to the bill. And that the good senator here is laughing, because germane can be in the eye of whoever has the authority to decide if it's germane or not, which means if they like it or they want to have the conversation, it's normally considered germane. If it doesn't, even though it's very apparent that it is something that relates to this, and they can say that it's not germane, and it is there. So you have to be very creative.
I'll throw a little bit of a curveball to you too. Sorry, I did not plan to ask this question. Would you say that with what you were just talking about in terms of conducting legislative business and things being germane in a short period of time, does that affect the degree that we might see bipartisanship coming through the Kansas legislature?
So I would say probably 90% of the bills that we pass are things that are bipartisan. They probably pass the House 125 to 0, the Senate 40 to 0. Those are not the issues that you see on the news or in the newspaper. So trying to do that, you have to build relationships. And so right now, I'm a Democrat. We have a Democratic governor. So that gives me leverage because I can try to, like, I think the governor's possibly gonna veto this, and then trying to find allies. So you have to be creative, and that gives you a little bit more of an in to try to have more say in the legislation, or if there's pieces that you don't think are gonna pass, that you can share that. Sometimes I share that, sometimes I let it be a surprise on the floor. And we've had a couple bills, education bills in the past that I knew would not get the votes to even get 21 votes, but the majority party, that was something that they cared about. So that strengthens your kind of way to legislate. I'm gonna add.
One of the things on each of the committees, there are three people really that run the committee. We have the chairman of the committee, the vice chair, but there's also the ranking member. The ranking member, people don't always know what that means, but that's the person who's appointed by the minority party to be their representative in that leadership in each committee. And so they have a say in what might be brought, what might not be, because they have to work together. Or at least we used to. I'm not sure they do today as much as we had hoped. But the ranking member is a member of that three-party or three-person segment in each committee. And they get together and decide what bills they might want to do and what how quickly they might want to get them through. And sometimes there's a lot of negotiation that goes on, but that's one way there's some bipartisanship that you see, because you do have that ranking member who is a part of that.
Thank you. So Senator Owens, the next question goes to you, which is, what does a typical day for a Kansas legislator look like? And what sorts of activities are legislators engaged in?
Well, I can tell you what a typical day for me was, and you need to understand, I've been gone from the legislature for about 12 years now. Doesn't seem like that long, but there was a different generation than Senator Sykes. But the legislature in both houses has changed considerably in many ways. But just to give you an idea about what a day for me was like, I would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I chose to drive back and forth. I represented a district here in Johnson County, and I chose to drive back and forth. I'd rather be at home in my own bed at night. And it was only an hour and 15-minute drive from my doorstep to the parking spot I had underneath the Capitol building. And so I would get up around 6 o'clock, get on the road, and I had to be in Topeka by 8 o'clock and ready to go with the first committee meeting. Committees are usually, it depends on whether you have 2 or 3 of them in the morning and 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So you have committees that you have to be there for. And especially if you chair them. Not good when the chairman isn't there. But so that's what we would do, is we would get to the committee, we'd get into the office and find out from our secretaries what might be on our agenda that they had found out about and let us know. Then go to the committees, run the committee. Each committee was about an hour long, which isn't very long to get the bills through. And then I chaired the Judiciary Committee, which is a committee that has more bills than any other committee in either house. It was just amazing how many bills we had, but to only get through 3 of them in an hour was saying a lot. So you have 2 ways. One, you have a hearing. Hearing on the bills meant people present the bill that have interest in it, they can speak on it. People from the public or people that are from the legislature who have presented it, they do that. After that, the next time you see that bill is when you work the bill. There's a term, working the bill. That's when the committee itself discusses what you've heard and whether or not to pass the bill through or not. And that depends upon the numbers. So that's on each committee that you're on. Lunchtime. Lunchtime, for me it got to the point I could not go out to lunch with every lobbyist that wanted to go to lunch. And so I made a decision that I wasn't gonna do that, and I told my secretaries, I said, look, just tell them that I'd be glad to have lunch with them, but they can bring it in and we can have it in my office and we can discuss what we need to, but then I didn't have to leave the building and go spend all that time. And worked out pretty well, although I got to know every chicken salad sandwich in the whole city of Topeka, because that's what they told them that I liked, and I do, but. So that was lunchtime. I would meet with people also during that time frame, people with constituents and anybody who wanted to come and talk to us about various issues. And back into the committee meetings in the afternoon, whatever they happened to be. And then after that, we would have various kinds of meetings that might come up if President of the Senate, when I was in the Senate, or the Speaker of the House would call a meeting. We'd have those party meetings. And squeezed in all of those things, you'd have meetings with your constituents and people that wanted to talk to you as well. Then in the evening, sometimes you'd have constituent events that they, people that lobbyists would want to talk with you, want to have a party or whatever, just have and meet and talk. And I would get home usually, I got home by maybe 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And my biggest fear was deer, because I was always driving to Topeka during the time they were out, and I was always driving home when they were out. So that was my biggest fear.
Yeah, I would say it's very similar even now on the Senate. We're on the floor at 2:30 for session. So when we're working the bills as all 40 senators, but those committee meetings in the morning. So if we're working bills in the floor, because I'm in a leadership position, I'm talking to the caucus, trying to make a plan for what we're going to be doing on the floor. If there's amendments that we want to have, who would be speaking to those, like trying to have kind of an idea, a plan for what's going on there. And also just meetings. I meet with the governor probably once a week, the Senate president once a week. And then if we are on the floor, we will have caucus meetings to discuss all of the bills that we're going to be working on the floor.
You might want to explain what the caucus is.
A caucus. So caucus is where it is all the Democrats would meet together, and we get normally the night before, if we're working, we have a list of all the bills, and I wish I'd brought like props, but we get a calendar each day and it has all the bills that are in committee, hearings in committees, but then there's this line on it. And so anything that is above the line for that day is what we would be working on the floor. So it could be one bill. Normally it's pretty light at the beginning of session, and then as we get to kind of those deadlines to where we have to pass everything that would go to the House or turn around, those you're really busy, and we may work 60 bills a day, but a lot of times we're not doing much in there. But anything above the line. So then in caucus, those rankings that Senator Owens was talking about, we have them talk about. So if it's a bill from judiciary, my ranking on judiciary takes the lead in explaining what this bill is, kind of what happened in committee, and if there was issues that they had, and then we discuss that, and we kind of go through all of the bills with that ranking member of each committee taking the lead on all of those bills.
Thank you. So one thing I think is a lot of people, when they see legislatures in general, only see the floor votes, but they don't know all of the work that goes on behind the scenes. So I really want to thank you for kind of shedding some light on all of the work that you all are doing that we don't see. So I'll send the next question to you, Senator Sykes. And what issues take up the most of the legislature's time? And then what issues have been the most prominent over the last several years?
So probably what takes up the most time, well, in the most recent has been tax bills. We've had Republican leadership in the Senate, in the legislature, has been at opposition with the governor. The governor had her tax proposals for tax cuts and the legislature had their proposals and they were at odds. And so trying to, they wanted to go to a flat tax. So one tax, we previously had a 3-tier system. We are now at a 2-tier system because of compromise in that. But I would say tax has been really what has taken it, because we were able to, we would pass something, the governor would veto it. We were able to sustain those vetoes. So it went back to the drawing board. We would have another bill, the governor would veto it, and we would go. And so that really took a lot of the oxygen out of the room, and a lot of other things were not passed because of that. The other thing, school funding, so we had a lawsuit, we have remedied that, and we are at fully funding, but special ed funding, we're still behind. So the legislature and the state picks up a portion, and then the local portion, and we have not met the state's obligation. And it doesn't mean that those special ed fundings, because it's mandatory. So if you're receiving special ed services, you're getting those services, but they're pulling money out. So that also has been a big topic. So I'm not missing any.
No, those are really key. I did serve on the tax committee in the House when I was there. I was in the House for 7 years and in the Senate for 4 years. And the tax committee was one of the major committees. Also, there are social issues that come up every year. We always had our abortion bill. Didn't matter what, anything else, you always had at least one, sometimes more. I had my good friend and seatmate from Western Kansas sat next to me, and he usually expressed himself, "Oh no, not again." So regardless of what side you are on that issue, it comes up every year. Something that comes up to go through. It's not unique to Kansas. I mean, you look at Missouri and some of the things they've got going on right now, but also another big issue that comes up, if it does pop up, it's usually controversial, and that's the gun issue. Anything dealing with guns, abortion, taxes, those are the biggest issues that we have to debate and discuss. I don't think there's any of the others that those are principal ones, I think. But social issues are huge, and they do get a lot of argument and a lot of time. And people wonder sometimes, why are you spending so much time when we really need to be talking more about the money? And I wish we had more time. I'd tell you about some of it's amazing some of the stories you get from people coming to, like on the tax issue. Sometime if you want, I'll tell you the story about the burying beetle. That's a unique story that we had in the tax committee, and we had a guy come in and wanted a tax exemption for the burying beetle, and I'll tell you more about that some other time.
That makes me laugh, because we had the boll weevil. We had, I think it was 7 hours on the Senate floor on that, because cotton growers were wanting to pay a fee to protect themselves from this boll weevil. And it was like $3 was the tax, and it went on for 7 hours. I was like, I will just put like a cap, like you can raise whatever you want if we can stop talking about this.
So Senator Owens, this next question will be for you. And speaking of issues, so you are a veteran who served in the U.S. Armed Forces. Does the work of the Kansas Legislature impact veterans, and if so, how?
I guess the short answer is yes, it does. If it relates to any kind of funding that you need to have through the legislature, and at the state level, you're probably talking about the National Guard, and whether it's the Air National Guard or the Army National Guard, they are funded and they are supported by the legislature to a large extent. They can be activated and federalized, and you see that happen fairly frequently, where they become under the US government then. But the state does have to pay attention to the adjutant general, who is the commander of all of the military forces in the Guard. So yeah, it does affect it. And other things can come up. There could be family issues that come up that affect people that are in the military and they get dispersed in some way or another. There are other things that people that move into the state that are military and their spouses want to go to work, but they might not be able to because they don't have the qualifications that Kansas requires, whereas they might be quite qualified from somewhere else. So does what we did in the legislature affect the veterans and their families? Yes.
And just to quickly follow up, was there a bill that was killed in the last legislative session that dealt with veterans and people trying to take oversee their benefits?
We had several bills. There was a property tax bill for veterans. I don't know about the benefits, but when he was talking about spouses working, we did pass legislation for that so that they have a time frame. So that if they're a nurse in Kentucky and they move to Kansas, they would be able to work immediately. Teachers are another one, but we did put some changes so that spouses don't have to go through that long process of getting their credentials in Kansas.
Thank you. And then this next question also goes to you, Senator Sykes. You're currently the ranking minority party member of the Senate's Committee on Education. So can you tell us how the work of the Kansas Legislature impacts K-12 and higher education in Kansas? And then in what ways might the legislature's work impact students?
The biggest way is funding. So we're the ones who appropriate the funding. In recent years, you're seeing, we have a state board of education for K-12, and then we have the board of regents for your higher ed that are kind of the governing body. So they do a lot of the policy. But in the past, well, honestly, probably since COVID, we've seen more and more bills coming through the legislature trying to give the legislature the say instead of those state board of education or the board of regents or local boards on what you're studying, whether or not certain books should be banned or not. Or we've had a parents' bill of rights so that parents know exactly what you are studying and they can agree or disagree. And so we're seeing more of that, but really funding is probably the biggest issue. But I think for, how does it impact students? I think you should be engaged because you have a perspective. And a lot of times it's not students who are there when we're having hearings to see for instance, if there was a book that they didn't want you to teach, there are already things that a student, if it's against kind of what they believe, that they can get another assignment and they can be out of the classroom. And talking for students, their perspective of how that has impacted them. And a lot of times it's parents or teachers or administrators. And I think it's very important to have student voices. We also, and we didn't have this on the Senate side, but on the House side, there was a bill, it was a gun bill that was there, and there had been the shooting at Olathe East High School. So there were some students who came and they were talking about how that had impacted them and whether or not they felt safe and so I think it's always important to have your voice. So even if you don't think it's something, there is a way that it's impacting your classroom and your teachers or social workers in the classroom and all of that.
Want to just follow up on something. How many of you know what the little blue stem is? It's the state grass. Now, there's all sorts of state things, like state animals, state, the state grass. Now, how do we get the little blue stem grass as the state grass? A 5th grade class from down in Fort Scott, I think it was, actually decided they wanted to have a say in something. So they decided that they wanted to name something, and they found out there was no state grass. So they came as a group, they came to the legislature and they got a bill for naming the state grass. And that bill went through and it became the state grass, thanks to a 5th grade class down in Fort Scott, Kansas. So does it make a difference? You bet. Does your voice? I'll tell you what, I really appreciated a lot of times when I would hear from students. And I also appreciated the fact that, you know, you all are here in Johnson County. I had 2 interns who came up when I was there. I happened to be teaching here as an engine. And I had 2 interns who came to the legislature, and there was a class that they had, but they were my interns. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and education does play a big part in that. And students' voices do get heard. We liked hearing from young people, liked hearing from old people too. But, you know, we heard a lot from those middle of the roaders, but when we heard from students, it really meant something.
I'm gonna go off script a little bit here again and just ask, if students wanted to get involved or know more about kind of the work of the legislature, how would they do that?
So we do have an intern program, and so you can apply, and that is normally through the Senate Vice President's office and then the Speaker Pro Tem's office on the House side. But you can reach out and we can get you connected. Also kslegislature.org. It has all the committee hearings. You can watch everything on YouTube now. You can follow and but reach out to your elected official, whether it's a House member or a senator, and sit down and have coffee with them. Talk about what's important for you, where you're going. I think it's great for you as you all are like starting out on your careers and figuring out what you want to do, just those relationships. But like Senator Owens was saying, you have a very important voice that needs to be heard, and a lot of times you're busy working, going to school, and sometimes that is missing. And to be able to have that, because there are lobbyists who are paid by different organizations, and a lot of people who are there, they have the means. But I mean, with COVID and where we have virtual hearings, like you can testify from your car, honestly, if you wanted to. Did I answer it?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Before I got into the legislature, I spent 24 years on the city council here. And one of the students that I got to know very well went to USC, Southern Cal. And he would call me periodically. He was from here. He would call me periodically to ask questions about things or ask if he could meet with me. I met with him several times when he would be back in town. And he would pass along thoughts that he had. And just to show you a little bit about how that goes, he's now on the city council in Overland Park. And so, you know, you get involved and ask the questions, and don't think there's a stupid question, because there isn't. So I would say, you know, that's one example of somebody a student who all the way from USC was interested in something that he had back home, and he contacted me and we met several times.
You can also shadow and spend a day with a legislature. Like we have page programs for kind of middle school and high school, but I always tell older to shadow, and then we'll get you a pass so you're on the floor and you can kind of go through and spend a day with the legislature.
Last off the conversation here. The relationship building has come up several times with these answers. And so I'm just interested on your takes on relationship building and the importance of relationship building in the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the number one thing, because my enemy today could be my ally tomorrow. So it's very important to have it about issues and not attacking that person. When I first was elected, and this is a funny story. So one of the most conservative members in the legislature at the time kind of sat diagonal to me and he goes, "Hey Sykes, do you eat meat?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "All right, I'm gonna take you for a hamburger." And so first of all, I sent one of my friends, I gave him my location on my phone. So if I didn't make it back, that he could come find me. But that started a relationship with this legislature. And so for 8 years, we would go and we started a pie caucus. And it was a time where it was Republicans and Democrats and independent. He was an independent at that point. And every 2 weeks, we would go and have pie together and we would try to solve the problems of the world. And we learned a lot of things about each other. So we may have different philosophies on our policy, but we really cared about the process. So sometimes I could get them as allies on some bills because of we didn't follow the process. And so I think you never know who your ally is gonna be, and sometimes you have strange bedfellows.
I think it's really important to build those relationships, and in Kansas, coming from Johnson County is kind of a unique thing because they used to, I don't know, they still do, they probably do. But if you were from Johnson County, you started there and then you went from there, because a lot of times people just did not want to deal with Johnson County because, by gosh, they came from western Kansas or southeast Kansas. And they'd say, well, you guys have all the money. We don't have that out here. Like I told you a while ago, my good friend sat next to me, was my seatmate. He was a rancher from north of Hays, Kansas. And I learned a very lot about that. We relied on each other. He would talk to me about law. I would talk to him about cows. And he had 6,000 of them. So getting to know people and where they come from and who they are, and just to show you something, he kept asking me why I didn't belong to the Masonic Lodge. He said, you know, your father was one, and why don't you belong? I said, well, I got a lot of things I'm doing. He said, well, I think you should. He kept after me. So finally I said, okay, I will join, but I'm gonna join your lodge. He said, well, my lodge is in Hays. I said, I know, I won't get there very often, but I'm gonna join your lodge because you want me to. And after that, you know, it's just kind of a connection. You build connections with these folks, and it may be on the strangest reasons or whatever. Like, I wish they'd have had a pie thing when I was there. But at any rate, it's that kind of thing, and you get to know people all over the state. And that's really important because you never know when you're gonna need to have their support from, you know, liberal Kansas, or when they're gonna need to have your support from Johnson County. So that's why I think it's really important to have those connections.
Thank you. With that, we have come to the end of the pre-written questions, and if anybody had any questions from the audience, I'm happy to share the microphone if you have questions that you wanted to ask. Oh, yeah.
How do you find the time to read these long bills if you're in committee for only an hour?
So that's a great question. So I was talking about that calendar, so you kind of know what's coming up. So you try to read them before. The other thing is we have what's called research and revisers, and they can give you summaries of those. So the budget bill, like I follow the process all along, but the budget bill is like this thick when it gets printed. So to read through all of that is really hard. So you're relying on others, but and in committee, so in committee you get it, but then it gets amended, and so you have to follow. So I'm always talking to my members who are in those committees of like, what happened to this? Where's it going? So you're following it along the process. And then there's bills that we tag kind of that we think are key bills to kind of watch the process. So I will sometimes even go back and watch committee hearings to see, you know, what happened in there. But that's something that I feel very there are a lot of legislators who do not read bills and they don't know what's in it. They just kind of get what they're told and that's how they vote. And I think that's one thing I'm really hoping that when we go back in January, that we can have kind of a 48 hours notice on bills to give more time, because there's nights that like at 11 o'clock at night, that's when we're finding out what we're going to be debating on the floor. So trying to make sure that you're following through on all of this is really hard.
When I chaired the committee, judiciary, I would tell my committee what ones we were gonna hear the next day, because I usually knew and I would read them all. But like she said, you know, the tax bills and some of those bills are huge and you're just not gonna be able to read the entire thing. So you rely on other people that have read parts of them or know, maybe they were the sponsor of the bill. So you rely on other people and get that input that way. You know, sometimes you just take the time in between your committee meetings. Like I said, I didn't go to lunch outside the building because I needed that extra time whenever I could find it to do some of that, reading the bills or talking to somebody or calling somebody. Then you have your interns, ask them to read through different things and then tell you a thumbnail sketch on what it's about so that you're ready to go when you need to. And then if you're gonna be debating it on the floor, if you're carrying the bill, you better read it. You better know what that bill is because you're gonna get questions from people on the floor. And that can be significant if you don't know the answers to those. So it's hard. It really is with all the bills you have. So committee chairs, there's a lot of responsibility for making sure you get those through and committee chair has to be pretty much on top of all of them that you have.
To share a funny story about that. So I was sitting in a committee for someone who wasn't able to be there. And there was an amendment as we were working the bill, and it was a microbrewery bill. And so I knew all about the microbrewery, like I knew all of this and the gallonages and all of this. Well, one of the revisors said, we need to make an amendment to update the language so it's similar to the language in other places of the law. And so we didn't have a copy of what that was, but we all agreed that yes, the language should be similar for other pieces of statute. And then we got on the floor and there was something in it and I was like, oh, like when did this happen? And it happened when I was in there, but when I went back to look, it was because the revisor said, you know, we're gonna put this in. But again, that was a time that we probably should have said, we need to see the language instead of just relying on it.
So you guys are only in session for 3 months a year? What do you do on the other 9?
So we're there from January till about May, so it's about 5 months. We do get a spring break in there. And so because I am in leadership, my position is I go to Topeka at least once a week, all year round. And so I'm meeting with people. I was recruiting, and so a lot of other things. So this is my full-time job now, even though it's not paid full-time, because I still get emails from constituents. I still, like this morning, I was at Children's Mercy talking to them about issues that they see coming for this session. We have interim meetings as well. But being in leadership, I do work full-time.
I think that's a good point. You know, we don't live in Topeka. We live here and we have, I think everybody I know has some other kind of occupation that they do. Quite honestly, I practiced law here for 45 years. I had a law practice and I was lucky that I had some associates in my law office that could fill in for me when I needed to have something where I had to go to Topeka or I was involved with that. That's one thing. And then meeting with constituents who want to talk to you. I had a lot of people would call me during the off season, and you're still representing everybody throughout the whole year. You just are not in your meetings in Topeka. So you are still their representative or their senator, and they will call and ask questions. So that's something that you do, but you try and do that, squeeze it in with your other occupation. You know, you just do what you can with the time, and time management is huge. So that's kind of, I guess, the best answer I can give you.
That kind of touched on it, at least in my mind, is legislative pay. And because Kansas is what would be considered like a not professional legislature because of the short session, you're sort of paid a partial salary due to the short term length. Is that?
Yeah, so I don't know how long our current, we had, prior to, when we go back in January, we will get a raise. But our pay was $88 a day for 90 days, which is what we're in session. And then you got a per diem to pay for, if a lot of our Western Kansas actually a lot of Johnson County legislators now stay in Topeka, so they'll rent a place or have a hotel room. I also commute back and forth because I like sleeping in my own bed, and it's just under an hour from my house to the Capitol. But we did, there was a task force that looked at legislative pay, and so we will be receiving increase from that $88 a day, and I don't know exactly what that amount was. So prior to that, I think I made under $12,000. I think it was like $8,000 my first year is what I made as a legislator for my salary. It is supposed to be about $40,000, which now it is much better. And I'm not sure how a lot of that, because like when we would go in for committees, we would get the salary, and I think now it's just kind of gonna go the entire year, but I don't know how all of that is, but it is a much better situation. And that was part of the problem, because when it was so low and you're taking 4 months, 5 months off of work, even if you are able to kind of do some jobs, it was hard for an employer to want you to do that, and you were taking a leave of absence from your job where you were actually being able to sustain your living. And then so it was hard to get candidates who were younger or young families to run for office because they just couldn't afford it. So I think with the pay raise, that is going to be better, so that it's not just retired or wealthy individuals. And you know, I had been a stay-at-home mom most of my life, so we kind of lived off my husband's, which is why I was able to run, but that's getting rarer as we're cost of living is going up.
I think you covered it.
What's the most difficult part about you guys' jobs?
Most difficult?
You go first.
Well, actually, I think we covered a little bit of it, and that's time management. Being able to do what you need to do and do it right and do it well. And I can tell you there are legislators, quite honestly, that don't do so well, and they don't time manage well. You know, and that's frustrating. I know legislators, every year we get a new set of statutes, the books, that you are supposed to, that's what you're really doing, is you're upgrading those. So getting those and then having colleagues who don't even open the box don't even read the statutes. That can be real frustrating. And dealing with people who don't believe the same way you do, sometimes in trying to pass laws that are gonna affect everybody in the state, no matter where you live, that can be frustrating, and those frustrations are there. I think that's probably the most difficult thing for me is time management, but if you do it right and you do it well, and you rely on your colleagues to, fill you in, like, whether I'm dealing with my seatmate and what he was dealing with in ranching and that sort of thing. You can make it easier, but it's not easy. And it's not easy dealing with issues that you may not feel real comfortable with, but you're gonna have to deal with them because you are gonna vote. Little example, there are in the especially in the House, you got buttons that you push. There's a green one for yes, a red one for no, and there's a white one for not voting or your attendance button. Once in a while, people would push the white button because they didn't want to vote on a particular issue and they'd show up here. My seatmate used to tell me periodically if I thought about pushing the white button, he said, that's not why we're here. So knowing when to do what you need to do and doing what you're doing for your constituents, it's not always easy.
I think it's probably working with people with different, I think everyone probably who is there wants to make Kansas better. They have different ways in which, I think what's frustrating to me is sometimes the marginalized when their voice isn't heard and trying to make sure that we're amplifying and talking about how consequences of legislation will affect people's lives. And not everyone takes time to really think through how will this impact someone.
Questions from the audience? How did you guys get to the positions that you guys are at right now? Cause I know you said you were like a full-time, stay-at-home law enforcement. So how did you remember where you are right now?
So I never saw myself in politics, and I worked in higher ed prior to having kids. And then when I had my kids, I had my own business as a personal chef and caterer. But I was very involved in my kids' school and PTA, and I really cared about my community and I'm not from Kansas originally. I grew up in Tennessee. And so my husband came to graduate school and we fell in love with Kansas and the quality of life. And so I was in the PTA, and at the time we were seeing cuts in the classroom, and my kids' school hadn't bought library books for 5 years. And so as PTA president, I was being asked to fund more and more things. And it made me start going to school board meetings and reach out to my representatives at the time. And my senator at the time was very anti-public education. And I would get condescending emails back from him. And so I was like, okay, I want to change this. And so I was trying to reach out, and kind of door after door was opening, and I ended up running for office, and I've learned a lot in the last 8 years. But I cared about my community and I wanted to make a difference, and I didn't think I was being represented. So filed for office and knocked on 10,000 plus doors. And then I got there and started learning from a fire hose, but it's completely worth it. And I know so many more things that I did. Like, I went in education was what I cared about, but I sat on local government. I sat on insurance. And I talked to my husband one night for like an hour on the difference between the banking codes for credit unions versus banks, and he was like, you need to stop. So but yeah, I just someone who cared and wanted to make a difference. Tim's is probably different.
I think one of the things that I feel very fortunate in is that everything I went to school to do, I've been able to do. And by that, I mean, my major in college was political science. I was very interested in politics and government. And lo and behold, here I've been able to be in 32 years of representative government. And also I worked for the city for a little while before I did that. But so political science, one educational area. When I got, when I graduated, I also got a commission in the Army. And I spent 26 years in the Army and the Army Reserve, 3 years active duty, 23 active reserve. And I was able to go through the Command and General Staff College. I ended up retiring as a full colonel. So another educational thing that got me somewhere where I really wanted to be. Then, so I practiced law because I went to law school. I wasn't sure I was going to be a lawyer. I didn't know exactly what, but I knew I wanted, law school was a good broad education. So I went to law school. I ended up practicing law for 45 years, doing these other things kind of in between. But again, practicing law, political science, military, all of those things I got to do, and everything I went to get educated in doing, I ended up doing. I would encourage you all, find out what you like to do, what you're excited to do, and go for it. And that's what I've done. And so I've lived a life that really allowed me to do that. And, you know, this is my wife up here. She came to be the critique for me, you know, and she spent 8 years on the city council after I left. And we raised 2 sons. One of them is now the city manager of Lawrence, Kansas. So, you know, you get just kind of, that's just how it kind of evolved for us. It was just in my blood, I guess. But that's how I got here.
Questions? All right, well, I want to thank our guests, Senator Dinah Sykes and Senator Tim Owens, for coming to talk to us about the Kansas Legislature. Thank everybody for coming.